The memoirs of the Gallic War are not simply the narrative of a conquest. They are a political manifesto, and perhaps an election pamphlet. Julius Caesar does not write just to tell us what happened in Gaul. He writes to convince us why it had to be done. Why would a general write a book in the midst of war? And in such neutral style? Is it because his audience is not the Gauls but the Roman voters? In this video, we will see how Caesar uses the Gallic War to justify a conquest, build a political profile, and prepare, without saying so, what will follow. When the Gallic War ends, Caesar doesn't just return to Rome. He returns to a city full of dangers, and the book he has already written is the most powerful weapon he holds in his hands. Caesar lived, fought, and wrote during the last period of the Roman Republic, which was characterized by the emergence of distinguished figures such as Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Cicero, Mark Antony, and Octavian. The fact that many of them are connected to assassinations, proscriptions, and civil wars explains the phrase that is still heard today. Situations like those that existed in ancient Rome. It is the period of the civil wars when the power of the generals, but also the competition between them, intensifies. It is in this context that Caesar's military operations and the writing of his memoirs should be placed. His appointment as prefect of Transalpine Gaul would have secured him a reputation as a capable military leader, a devoted army, and significant financial resources. The writing of his work, on the other hand, was not only due to the necessity to record military operations or to stimulate the imagination of an educated public about something unknown and distant, like the Gaul of the last pre-Christian century. Caesar needed to show the service he had provided to Rome in order to gain political influence. The work was completed in 51 BC, the period when Caesar had set his sights on the consulship of 49 BC. However, according to Roman law, he had to resign his military post in order to run for public office. Of course, at that time he could not be exempt from possible criminal prosecution, at a time when he had enemies who wished to thwart his plans. By publishing the Gallic War, Caesar could show his gratitude to his soldiers and demonstrate his dignitas, the Roman virtue of success. This work also functioned as an instrument of his political self-presentation. The Commentarii de Bello Gallico are divided into 8 books. In them, Caesar describes the country, the Gallic tribes with their customs and social life, his campaigns, the counterattacks of these tribes, the great rebellion of Vercingetorix, and, of course, the siege of Alesia. The 8th book was written by Caesar's officer, Aulus Hirtius. It recounts the last military operations and certain political developments in Rome, serving as an introduction to the Civil War. Caesar begins his work with a description of Gaul. Although he divides the country into 3 parts, the use of expressions such as the whole of Gaul or all Gaul suggests a perception of the land as a single entity. Therefore, Gaul should be completely conquered. Partial conquest does not constitute conquest, and the various military conflicts between Romans and Gauls are attributed to the fact that there are still free Gallic tribes. This also explains the brief mention of Germany, which is quickly marginalized in the narrative. Caesar had been placed in charge of Gaul, not Germany anyway. The Gauls are characterized by an impatience to fight that usually leads to their defeat. However, the Celts were not only impatient or undisciplined warriors. As described in the 2nd book, during the siege of an allied Gallic city by the Belgae, it is reported that a large crowd of warriors gathered at a certain point on the wall and immediately began throwing stones. After forcing the besieged to seek cover, the warriors, in a turtle formation, started undermining the walls. In the 7th book, Caesar reports that during the Roman siege of Avaricus, the Gauls launched counterattacks against the Roman positions in successive waves. Unlike the legionaries, who were forced to fight continuously and therefore tire, the Celtic waves of attacks allowed the besieged to replace the tired warriors. The Gauls' ability to learn from the Romans was not limited to imitating their formations. During the same siege, the defenders built underground tunnels and towers, poured hot oil, and placed sharp sticks outside the walls, techniques that, according to Caesar, were effective. It is worth mentioning a piece of information that Caesar transmits in the third book. In an effort to learn more about their enemy, the Gauls sent envoys to Iberia, present-day Spain, seeking advice from the Celtic tribes there on how to effectively fight the Romans. Some of these tribes had fought on the side of the Roman Quintus Sertorius when he had rebelled a decade earlier. So unlike the Germans, the Gauls seemed to have the ability to learn from the Romans and adopt advanced warfare techniques. The reference to the Gauls' fighting spirit and ability to adapt to the demands of war normalizes them and reinforces their image as people who must be conquered. On the one hand, Caesar can be proud of having enslaved such a people, and on the other, neutralizing the threat of a warlike and dangerous enemy. Reference has already been made to the way the country is described. Let us now turn to how Caesar describes the tribes. A political motive is apparent. The Gauls are described as a people worthy of conquest, and most importantly, capable of being Romanized. In this context, we can place Caesar's choice to grant Latin status, something that partially corresponds to the status of Roman citizen, to the Gauls beyond the Alps who were under Roman rule. The Germans, on the other hand, live like semi-wild nomads on the edge of the known world. They do not live in one place, which is why they feed mainly on hunting and avoid the goods of civilization, from the export of which the Romans derived enormous benefits, like wine, or are considered essential for permanent settlement, like agriculture. Since they avoid these goods, they have nothing to offer Rome. The way in which the causes that push the Gauls to war are presented is also political. The generally human pursuit of freedom is mentioned, perhaps even hatred for the Romans in some cases. The real motives are thus hidden: the dissolution of ancient social structures and the political and economic oppression of the Roman army, the draining of large areas with the belief that any rights guaranteed by Roman legislation should be put into effect at some later stage, when the enemies had been subdued. The Gallic gold had ended up in the hands of the conquerors, while the sale of prisoners of war also yielded great profits. Do the memoirs of the Gallic War serve as an introduction to the Civil War? At the end of the 8th book, the author, Urtius, refers to events unrelated to the Gallic War, such as the detachment of 2 legions from Caesar, following a decision by the Senate, and their assignment to Pompey under the pretext of the campaign in Parthia. The reference to Marcellus and his attempt to reduce Caesar's value and power gives the impression that the atmosphere in Rome at that time smells of gunpowder. Perhaps this also explains the fact that at the end of each campaign in Gaul, Caesar returned to the Cisalpine Gaul, in order to be close to the center of political developments, the city of Rome. Caesar had conquered Gaul, but in doing so, he had also reshaped Rome and set the stage for a far greater conflict. What followed was not another campaign in distant lands, but a war at the heart of Rome itself.